Hello! We've all heard that Soviet housing was grey and grim. To pop that bubble, it's mostly nonsense. Looking at a badly maintained building constructed in 1975 with an estimated lifespan of 30 years in 2025, unpainted or renovated, isn't how you should evaluate this form of housing. Check them out in their lifetime, or a contemporary renovated building of the era, and you'll get a more accurate picture. In reality, the USSR lifted millions from flimsy surf shacks into dignified 20th century apartments with basic amenities like running water and kitchens, with little to no rent. The USSR, devastated by both world wars, built and rebuilt homes based on human need, at scale. They weren't perfect, of course, but they took people from 16th century to 20th century living standards in just a few decades. Soviet housing was good, actually. Before we can talk about commune blocks, we need to understand what housing was like before the October Revolution. Tsarist Russia was technologically and socially far behind the West, or the rest of the world for that matter, often called a feudal backwater, with rural areas living much the same way they had been living since the 1500s. A very common type of home in central and northern Russia were chimneyless homes made of logs with thatched roofs, called smoky houses, due to the smoke from their black stoves. Having equal sides that were 4 to 6 meters long, with floors of either hard-packed dirt or wooden planks, these cramped dwellings had to accommodate the typical Russian extended family: mom, dad, adult sons, and their families. Basically 2 more nuclear families living together. When lit, the front door was left open so that smoke could get out, but regardless, occupants would have smoke in their face. The main fuel for these stoves was rye straw. Before being used for fuel, it served as bedding, preferably changed daily, though only possible during harvest. In leaner years, straw from the roof or whatever was available went to feeding livestock. Without straw, they had to use dried manure or weeds, like thistle and nettles, the smoke from which caused cataracts in children and the elderly. Manure was also mixed with clay to form bricks for housing, reflecting the deep poverty. Another type of common home post-1870 were brick houses, typically with a small yard containing livestock pens in the corners and a shed for storing grain, flour, footwear, and other items. In St. Petersburg, a microcosm of Russia, only 3.6% of people owned their home, the rest rented from their local lord. Most families lived in single-room dwellings, inside which benches lined the walls and a sleeping loft spanned the entrance with only a table and portable stools for furniture. They universally lacked basic modern amenities like indoor plumbing, central heating, or electricity. To be specific, 23% had a bathroom, 34% had heating, and only 7% had electricity. Accounts detail how families would, during harsh winters, share their single-room homes with their livestock: sheep, cows, and pigs. Rents in Russia were relatively stable from 1880 through the 1890s, but around 1905, the year of the first revolution attempt, everything changed. Rent swung wildly and reached unprecedented heights. Unsurprisingly, the largest surge happened right after the start of World War I, when rents shot up dramatically. The confluence of feudal dependency, primitive and dangerous living conditions, and the severe rent instability, exacerbated by war, created a profound crisis in Russia, as you may imagine, fueling the discontent that shaped the revolutionary era and ultimately the drive for mass housing solutions. This is the legacy that the USSR inherited at birth, so to speak: an underdeveloped economy with a predominantly rural population. Only 2 cities, Moscow and Leningrad, had populations of more than 1 million. In the revolution's immediate aftermath, the state nationalized bourgeois homes to create communal apartments for workers, a temporary fix for acute housing shortages in industrial cities. So starting in the late 1920s and the early 1930s, the Soviet government began the vital work of building homes for the people. The new districts, called socialist cities, were meant to provide millions of people housing as fast as humanly possible. These cities were designed by 17 German and Austrian architects and urban planners headed by Ernst May, an early proponent of standardized residential building design. What set these cities apart was their careful planning. It was expected that people would live communally. While they lived in relatively small private spaces, this was paired with shared facilities for eating, working, laundry, and childcare. Obviously, these living spaces would not be particularly attractive to people today, but at the time it was an unthinkably massive upgrade. It made things previously inaccessible available to the majority of people, like bathrooms or kitchens. Ivanovo-Voznesensk was an industrial town northeast of Moscow that pioneered Soviet urban infrastructure. In 1922, they launched water and sewer systems, the next year power stations and central heating, and they opened the USSR's first workers' canteen in 1925, which fed 25% of the city's laborers. In 1925, a state housing cooperative built the first workers' settlement alongside groundbreaking facilities such as the nation's first daycare center and modern school. These settlements would feature multi-family wood frame housing and then later on stone and wood designs, which established a model for nationwide development. The mid-1920s debates amongst the nation's architects landed on two competing visions of housing and city organization: garden cities, which promoted private plots, and the French-style communes, which required total collectivization. Planners considered cottage sprawl as wasteful and instead advocated multi-story blocks and prioritized integrated communal services like nurseries and laundries in these new developments. At the same time, infrastructure expanded nationwide. The famous Moscow-Mytishchi Railway was built and electrified in 1928 and became the foundation of the future transit system. Standardization accelerated in 1928 under Moisey Ginsburg, who successfully pioneered prefabricated transitional apartments for mass assembly in the USSR. In 1930, the USSR stopped pushing so-called super-collectivization and endorsed individual family apartments instead, with their own kitchen and bathroom instead of previous communal spaces. Farm collectivization under the 5-year plan drove mass rural migration, requiring the building of 200 brand new towns with associated prefabricated buildings. At the time, there were two versions of these buildings: brick structures with ornate facades and larger apartments, and smaller cinder block units. The most important thing here is that this state-built housing, post-war at least, transitioned from communal amenities to every apartment having its own amenities, its own kitchen, its own bathroom, a toilet, central heating, features absent in pre-revolutionary housing and only available communally before World War II. This aligned with the state's foundational role as housing provider since the 1917 nationalization, although 20 to 25% of urban housing remained privately owned. Average apartment sizes at the time approached European norms and construction surged. State-led projects delivered 72 million meters squared of urban housing in 1946 to 1950, 70% of the 102 million square meters total built. This scale was only achievable by pivoting to industrialized prefabricated concrete panel construction, which was deployed on a scale never before seen or since. State construction consistently exceeded targets by 6% in 1956 to 1960, while private housing lagged. I should point out, though, that a contemporary CIA assessment claimed that there were significant growing pains and that panel construction was poor quality, more expensive than planned, and fell short of expectations, specifically in 1960. Of course, this is the CIA, so take it with a grain of salt, but it's interesting that they only claimed 1 year had such problems. By 1991, 75% of all Soviet housing stock was built using this method. The 1959 plan formalized this growth, allocating 320 billion rubles to build 15 million urban homes. Despite these initial hurdles, the system was refined and scaled enormously. From the late 1960s onwards, effort was put into varying the style, even if the structural aspects remained identical. In places like the Caucasus or Central Asian republics, panels came with precast Islamic details or cultural elements or otherwise artistic liberties relevant to the geographic region. Elsewhere, mosaics on revolutionary or national themes enlivened these facades. In estates in Vilnius or Wrocław, curved rather than rectilinear panels were placed in irregular patterns, giving them a more interesting appearance. By the 1980s, annual production reached 2 million state-provided units, which surpassed global volumes. On its own terms of solving a housing crisis quickly, it was a historic success, creating housing that was free, modern, and culturally diverse. Back to the video in just a minute, let's hear from today's sponsor, Incogni. Most people don't realize it, but their personal information is already scattered across the internet. Data brokers and people search sites collect everything: your home address, phone number, relatives' names, even court records, and publish or sell it without your consent. That means strangers, scammers, or even stalkers can look you up in seconds. And the risks can be very real. Criminals have used stolen personal data to take out loans in other people's names. Even employers or insurers might buy this information to make decisions that affect your future. Once your data is out there, it doesn't just sit still. It gets copied, resold, and spread across countless sites. Trying to clean it up manually could take hundreds of hours. That's where Incogni comes in. They do the hard work for you by contacting hundreds of data brokers directly and demanding your information be removed. Their system keeps following up too, making sure your data doesn't just pop back up. And with their custom removals feature, you can send them any specific link where your information is exposed and their team will handle it. And for my viewers, you can get a massive 60% discount on an annual Incogni plan using my link and the code HAKIM. Getting started is simple. You just create an account, you authorize Incogni to act on your behalf, and you sit back while they track down your data and work to remove it. They even send you progress updates so you always know what's happening. So what are you waiting for? Click my link in the description, use the code HAKIM, and get your 60% off an annual Incogni plan and start protecting your data today. Thanks to Incogni for the sponsorship. This allows me to pay my editor fairly, which is much appreciated. Alright, back to the video.
Today the city is in a fervor of new construction, and today the buildings are constructed to give the dwellers and workers all the benefits of sunshine and fresh air.
In the USSR, people got housing and other social services from the state. So what about rent or other costs incurred by people getting access to mass housing before World War II? Or the state-of-the-art apartments and homes built afterwards? In the USSR, rent was either ceremonial or didn't exist. This is because Article 44 of the Constitution guarantees housing as a right for all citizens and should be provided for free to the people. That means that while private housing was available in the USSR, it was never viewed as a commodity. Housing was built to meet people's needs, not profit. The state's provision of this housing required a massive and continuous financial investment, though its implementation faced early challenges. The first 5-year plan allocated 4 billion rubles for new state housing, yet the plan for increasing living space was fulfilled by less than 50% due to rising construction costs. The state's priority on housing necessitated a shift to more efficient industrialized methods. As we mentioned, in 1960, the introduction of prefabricated panel construction allowed the USSR to build more cheaply, a process refined throughout the 1970s with improved standard designs that included modern conveniences like larger kitchens, washrooms, more uniform central heating in every unit, amongst other things. This system enabled an unprecedented expansion of housing, particularly in the Baltic republics. For example, mass housing was a large-scale enterprise in Lithuania. Vilnius's housing stock multiplied nearly 5 times between 1945 and 1990. The complexity of these projects is illustrated by the 1968 plan for the Vaikai Osmai district in Soviet Estonia, which mandated a specific initial construction sequence: 2 courtyards with 9-story and grouped 5-story residential buildings, 1 school, 3 kindergartens, and a service center had to be built first. Major investment in less glamorous but crucial infrastructure, such as the installation of sewage collectors, were absolute prerequisites before any other work could begin. This monumental undertaking achieved an unparalleled scale and speed of construction that housed millions and transformed the urban landscape into a model that would be copied later but not usually credited. Mass housing the people of the USSR under extraordinary difficult conditions remains one of the Soviet Union's most significant logistical and social achievements. In many ways, they were ahead of their time. As mentioned earlier, cities in the USSR were initially designed around being communal, where some things were handled by community services. This approach was rooted in an ideological drive to socialize daily life, moving functions like cooking, cleaning, and childcare from the private apartment into the collective sphere. An evolution from the early experimental house communes that provided ample communal space for joint activities. These services usually included administrative centers, stores, restaurants, laundry facilities, and green spaces. This vision was physically organized around the concept of the microrayon, micro-district, a self-sufficient superblock planned with a tiered system of services based on frequency of use and distance, ensuring daily needs like kindergarten, schools, and food shops were within 400 meters of every home. The ambition to provide these rich service networks was a key part of the design, though at times they were undersupplied.
The United States, by encouraging private car ownership, has done little to promote low-cost public transportation. The opposite is true in the Soviet Union, where most people travel by train, bus, and streetcar.
To help people get around and between these new cities and micro-districts, the USSR wisely decided to weave public transport infrastructure into the foundation to make neighborhoods easily navigable and walkable. This was considered essential because at the time, it was basically a carless society, given how poor the country was before the revolution. Moscow's metro became the envy of the world, not only because it was so clean and efficient, it was also lavishly designed and decorated. This resulted in a dense, highly interconnected network across the USSR that carried approximately 50 billion passengers in 1974, accounting for over 90% of all travel modes in the nation. Furthermore, Soviet planners built wide, spacious roads in housing estates, which have, somewhat ironically, proven capable of handling today's high car traffic volumes. Now, this is not a scripted bit, but there are indications in early planning, it's not so early at that point, we're talking 1970s and 80s, that private vehicles would be more widespread eventually. And as a result, they wanted to plan ahead for this. So there were these wide roads already planned from the 50s even. So they were thinking very long term at the time. It's very interesting to see. Getting back on track, those who have never experienced public transport in formerly socialist nations can't really understand what I mean with how well made it was. The gutted and badly maintained public transport infrastructure of modern-day Slovakia or Moldova, for example, still work relatively well, which is a testament to what was built over half a century ago at this point. Obviously, we don't have the USSR around anymore to compare to, but let's see how the US and the West in general are doing in regards to housing in the modern day. According to capitalist ideology, the market should have, at a minimum, distributed housing as or more efficiently in the so-called first world, right? Well, it didn't. This stands in stark contrast to the foundational Soviet principle enshrined in the Constitution, which guaranteed housing as a social right, with the state responsibility for its provision and upkeep, distributing it according to the need with rent fixed at a minimal, subsidized cost proportional to income. Let's take a look. As of 2025, US home prices are up 60% since 2019, and interest rates are at an all-time high, leading to home buying falling to its lowest level since the mid-1990s. This isn't surprising. The price of a single-family home is now over $400,000, 5 times the median income. In response to these market forces, US home builders reduced the median size of a new single-family home to 2,150 square feet, discounted houses, and offered low introductory mortgage rates. These measures did nothing to help. Monthly mortgage payments still hit a record $2,570, 40% higher than 1990 adjusted for inflation. I'll spare you the math, but that means that you need to make at least $126,000 a year. In fact, 53% of metro areas now require $100,000 plus in incomes to buy a median-priced home, up from only 11% in 2021. As fewer people can afford homes, they are renting more. Since 2023, 1.25 million people have become renters according to the Census Bureau's Housing Vacancy Survey. This increase in rental demand is occurring despite a massive surge in new apartments hitting the market. Doesn't this violate the law of supply and demand? Not really. The issue is that most of these new apartments are luxury units that run for $2,000+ a month, which is increasingly out of reach. Between 2013 and 2023, luxury unit stock grew from 3.6 to 9.1 million, while units that go for less than $1,000 dropped more than 30% from 25 million to 17 million. This explains some of the weirdness. The stock of apartments that are increasingly rare are exactly those seeing higher demand due to a flailing economy. Landlords have responded by raising rents astronomically. In 2023, the number of households that are cost-burdened, defined as spending 30% or more on housing, rose to a record 22.6 million, meaning 50% of renters. This is a crushing burden, especially when compared to the Soviet system, where rent was mandated to consume only 3 to 4% maximum of a family's income. Worse still, over 12 million of those people are considered severely cost-burdened, which means spending 50% or more of your income on housing. Given all of this, in 2024, the US recorded the highest number of unhoused people, 771,000, officially at least. Unfortunately, almost every population reached record levels. Families with children had the largest single-year increase. Speaking of children, 150,000 children experienced homelessness in 2024. Between 2023 and 2024, children experienced the largest increase in homelessness. Of course, since this is the US, there's a racist component as well. While Black Americans only make up around 12% of the total population, they are 32% of the unhoused population, which is caused by a number of systematic factors that are beyond the scope of this video. Before EU folks get too high and mighty, Europe also has issues. 10% of EU households are spending over 40% of their income on housing. That is, they are cost-burdened. Greece has the highest cost burden at 28.5%. Additionally, 16% of EU citizens live in overcrowded households, with those in Latvia, 40.9%, Romania, 40%, and Bulgaria, 34.9%, seeing the highest rates of overcrowding. Soviet housing gradually and successfully got larger as time went on, with late-era apartments reaching contemporary European apartment sizes by the 1980s, with future increases planned and in progress until they are abruptly stopped due to the illegal and undemocratic dissolution of the USSR. In comparison, the market, on the other hand, has not grown housing stock or apartment size in the Baltics or other post-social states in any meaningful way. This crisis emerged from a system treating housing as a market commodity. The Soviet alternative emerged from a different premise. Following a period of underinvestment due to a focus on heavy industry, the state embarked on the largest public housing project in history, as we've seen here. The leadership mobilized the entire state apparatus, more than doubling capital investment to build over 2 million units annually, achieving a scale and consistency of construction unmatched at the time. This was powered by a technological revolution in prefabrication. Using standardized concrete panels allowed for rapid mass construction, independent of weather or scarce skilled labor. Remember, they didn't just build apartments, they created entire integrated communities with schools, daycares, clinics, social spaces, all within walking distance. This contrasts starkly with the vast sprawling inefficiency that is US suburbs. From the late 1940s onwards, the core principle was provision of basic services. Each apartment, though initially small, was equipped with modern utilities like running water, sewage, central heating, and electricity. A decisive leap in quality of life for a population emerging from primitive, often wooden, one-story housing where overcrowding was the norm. Over the decades, the design significantly improved. with apartments growing in size and functionality, featuring separate bathrooms, larger kitchens, balconies, and dedicated spaces for washing machines and storage. This massive state investment, consuming a significant portion of the national budget across multiple 5-year plans, succeeded in raising the national standard of living for all people. This shows a dedication to domestic tranquility that has no parallel in the US. The system of course faced significant challenges: persistent shortages due to rapid urbanization, regional disparities in quality or space, long waiting lists that often failed to capture the true scale of need. However, the foundational commitment to decommodify housing, providing as a social right, and integrating it into a planned urban environment stands a historic triumph not matched since except for maybe China. Now things again were not perfect, so let's discuss the cons now that we've seen some of the pros. It's important that we understand the context in which these events and decisions took place and what shaped these outcomes. As mentioned earlier, the average size of Soviet housing was generally smaller, and on large-scale, densely populated communal residences in wide multi-story buildings focused on meeting basic human needs efficiently. Early on, this meant little access to extra private spaces within each unit, beyond a bedroom and a living room. Furthermore, the apartments were largely identical, with a unit's vertical location in the building usually being its main distinguishing feature. The first and second floors were typically seen as the best option in 5-story walk-ups, before widespread elevators, while the ground floor was considered the worst for its lack of privacy. And the top floor would be either too hot or too cold depending on the season. The process of allocating these apartments, intended to be fair through a lottery system, was often perceived as discriminatory or introduced certain incentives for corruption. Despite the remarkable volume of construction, the system struggled with persistent shortage. For example, approximately 200,000 apartments were built in Riga from 1958 to 1990, yet the increase in construction speed and volume did not keep up with the population growth, especially because of how economically dynamic the Baltics were for the Soviet Union. As a result, the average provision of residential living space didn't increase and actually subtly decreased from 19.2 meters squared per person in 1940 to only 18 meters squared by the beginning of the 1990s. With that in mind, let's also remember Soviet mass housing programs emerged in times of profound crises and devastation. Wars caused widespread property destruction in the west of the USSR, modern-day Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, which left over 25 million people unhoused, necessitating the rebuilding of 1,710 cities and towns that were fully or partially destroyed. This scale of physical devastation has no parallel in US history. Hell, the US has difficulty housing a few 100,000 people across several decades, let alone many tens of millions. Industrialization in the 1930s triggered massive migration from the rural areas to the cities, overcrowding the existing inadequate infrastructure. New arrivals had to live in tents and makeshift shacks around construction sites due to a lack of space and housing in old districts. The Tsars of Russia were never known for their investment in infrastructure, so the USSR was never really playing with a full deck. Despite many negative opinions or memes regarding this type of housing, polling is clear that these large socialist-era housing estates are still viewed as good places to live in, and in many instances, better than contemporary construction by their long-term residents. These estates have become vital parts of people's lives. Residents to this day appreciate the modest planning ideals that they embodied, like ample green space, quiet neighborhoods, and convenient public transport connections to separate work and recreational areas. In fact, the vast majority of Eastern Europe has continued this kind of construction, albeit on a much smaller scale. There's a reason for this. It just works. So in conclusion, this is one of the most prevalent memes about the USSR. The ugly commie buildings were grim and dystopian. The reality is much more exciting and impressive, actually. They took millions upon millions of people from dangerous medieval peasant huts to 20th century modern apartments with running water, kitchens, and heat, things that we really do take for granted. No other country besides modern China has lifted more people out of abject poverty and servitude than the USSR, and they basically had to do it twice. Remember too that they were also sending satellites and people to space at the same time they were building mass housing. This cannot be overstated because the achievement is among the most impressive in history. In only 36 years, they went from feudal, manure-covered walls, choking on smoke, to being one of the most technologically advanced countries, with people living in climate-controlled apartments, with running water, indoor flushing toilets, and recreational amenities. The USSR had its fair share of problems, which should always be discussed, but it's intellectually bankrupt to claim the USSR did anything other than perform something just short of a miracle when it comes to people's living standards. Soviet housing was good, actually. Doesn't mean we need to recreate it exactly how it was done, but there's a lot to learn from. The market, as has been made clear over and over, doesn't have the solution. A better world is possible. Alright, that's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you too.